If you don't mind, just off the top of your heads, would you mind like telling us what your favorite and least favorite part of playing this was?
I'll be honest, and I hate to say this, but I don't think there was a single thing I enjoyed.
My friend Kyle and I made a game in 2 weeks for a competition, and as you can tell, it didn't go very well. But what actually went wrong? To get into that, let's start from the beginning. As I've been trying to get into more game development communities, I found myself stumbling into the homemade trading card game Discord server. And the coolest part about this server is that it hosted game jams, something that I usually thought was reserved for video games. For the uninitiated, a game jam is a competition where you have a set amount of time to make a game. Then you are given a prompt or theme to follow. Once the allotted time is over, the game is judged and you see who wins. Kind of like a 24-hour film festival or a hackathon if you're familiar with one of those. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into the development of our Game Jam entry for the May 2024 HTCG Land Jam, Armies against Entropy. In preparation for this jam, I partnered up with my buddy Kyle. You may remember him from my first devlog of Soul. We made the original version together. Anyway, we decided the first thing to do was to look over the judging criteria, come up with a schedule, and divide up responsibilities. This all pretty much went out the window day one, so I don't know why I bothered telling you this, but let's get on with it. As I said, this jam was hosted by the homemade trading card game Discord community, and as with most jams, there was a theme to help keep everything fair and keep people from submitting projects they worked on for years or whatever. In this case, the theme was lands. For all you trading card game people, this was clearly very Magic the Gathering inspired. Upon hearing this, Kyle and I got a document together and started brainstorming ideas. This was pretty stream of consciousness, and we tried not to discount any ideas from the start. And while we didn't take all these ideas directly, a lot of them did help us come up with different mechanics for the game. So here's some of the ideas we came up with. Land is mana, basically like Magic the Gathering. I'll say this wasn't something we wanted to do, but it was worth putting out there because it's probably everyone's first thought. That said, our goal was to move away from this and defy any expectations. Land is a battle arena / cards you fight over. I'm pretty sure I've seen other games like this before. I couldn't name them off the top of my head, but I've definitely seen it. Basically, this would be a card that you play other cards on top of to battle. Then you get to claim the land if you succeed, which would then give you some sort of benefit or bring you closer to a win condition. A game like Stack Lands. The word lands made me think of the game Stack Lands. If you haven't played this game, I would definitely recommend it. This ended up being a pretty big inspiration for the game, so we'll get into that more a little bit later. Lands are spawner cards. I was originally thinking of Loop Hero when I thought of this idea, but we ended up kind of using a little bit of this concept, but not exactly from the idea that we wrote down. We'll get more into that later. So despite us saying we had 4 days to come up with a core idea on our schedule, we already had one day one. We liked the idea of something like Stacklands, a resource management game where you generate resources and battle monsters. We ignored the sort of survival aspect with the, exception of the battling monsters part. We also decided we wanted this game to be cooperative. We thought that it would work better for this sort of format and something more unique that we could bring to this jam. Kyle had work, so before starting this game in earnest, we did a bit of brainstorming and tried to expand upon this idea in the meantime. Here are the thoughts we came up with. The game was going to have one resource. While Stacklands or other resource management games usually have many resources to manage, we wanted to take a simpler approach. This is partly because we wanted the scope to be smaller, but also because we wanted the game to be as simple as possible. While a video game like Stacklands might be able to manage having players deal with nitty-gritty resources, a real physical card game doesn't really lend itself to that and can end up bogging the game down. To go along with this, we decided land would generate units. These units acted as both health and damage when placed onto cards. We had debated on whether or not these units would be different types of creatures and had different effects based on what generated them, having different lands generate different units, but we figured in the end this would make the game much more cluttered despite maybe sounding more interesting. So we ended up keeping the units basic and allowed the card to change the unit's functionality. For example, the idea behind it was like sending a peasant to a castle makes them a knight. We also decided units would be represented by tokens rather than cards. Originally I was opposed to this idea, seeing we were trying to make it like a trading card game, but then I looked at Magic and was like, oh, right. Anyway, more on units in a bit. We also decided there would be 5 types of cards: gods, heroes, structures, lands, and spells. Spells we didn't include in the first version as it didn't seem necessary for our minimum viable product, but we got them in later in the development. Our last thought was that maybe this game could either be played as a co-op game or a dueling game. We decided to test the dueling game first because we didn't really need to make a monster deck and we could just jump right into playtesting. It being the weekend and finally having all our ideas together, Kyle and I met up on Discord and quickly put together a player deck. We used a lot of placeholder stuff like random fictional hero names and random structure ideas. Then once we got it all together, we sat down and played the game. And unfortunately, it sucked. It wasn't fun at all due to the game basically being made in such a way that whoever went first would always be the winner. We really didn't want this to be a dueling game anyway, so we pretty much gave up on that idea and decided to start making a monster deck. So in that vein, we started working on the mechanics for the evil deck, and here's what we came up with. The evil deck would have similar types of cards: monsters, which were just heroes renamed, structures, lands, and spells, and then what we were tentatively calling demons, which were the opposite of gods. However, to keep this from getting too confusing, I'm going to call them by their final names, which were the old gods instead of demons. Secondly, rather than having units, monsters would have a set power level, along with an attack order. This meant we didn't have to make any decisions allocating units or deciding who they attack on their turn. The cards essentially play themselves. And lastly, we wanted some sort of conquest mechanic. One of our ideas for this was to have reversible cards. As you defeat an evil card, it would flip and then become yours. However, we decided to start simple and just have it so the cards granted bonuses on the evil card's death. So one of the things I didn't mention is from the time we sat down around 7-ish, we had a playtestable game around 11. That includes making the players only version and the monster version and playtesting both. This was possible because of a few tools: Google Sheets, Dexterous, and Tabletop Simulator. Google Sheets allowing us to make spreadsheets for our cards, Dexterous being able to interpolate that information into cards, and then seamlessly importing it into Tabletop Simulator. I'll probably be making a video on that at some point, but I would definitely recommend checking that stuff out if you're making your own game. And because these tools were available to us, we were able to make a fully playtestable version in 4 hours. And the crazy part about it is that it was fun. We were already seeing the game taking shape, the game felt cool, and the interactions and synergies of the cards were already coming together. We were just having a good time playing. So now that the game was functioning, let's actually explain how the game works rather than just talking in vague terms. First, the players would select a god. The gods act as a sort of passive bonus along with being your lose condition. If your god dies, you lose the game. You also choose your opponent's old god to serve as the difficulty of the game. Then players would draw cards from their deck, and that's basically the extent of setup. Then on a player's turn, they will draw a card and play cards into their play space. This includes heroes, structures, lands, and spells. After cards are played, then you enter the unit phase. Here, any cards that gain units do so and are placed onto the cards. From there, you're allowed to move the units from card to card, granting them more power. Effectively, these units grant you more health, and if the card can attack, it grants them more attack power. After this, you're allowed to attack, and then your turn will be passed to the next player. But before we talk about attacking, let's talk about the enemy. The old god determines how many cards it draws per turn. As it draws cards, they are placed in order and then resolved. Monsters with an attack order attack, and then all other cards do the effect that is set on the card. So with all that said, let's go back to attacking. When a player attacks a monster, they must have a sufficient number of units to destroy them. When they do so, they will lose the number of units equal to the card's power level. On the other hand, if a monster attacks, the player's card will lose that number of units, but the monster will not take any damage. And lastly, if a player manages to destroy all the other Old God cards from their deck, then they can attack the Old God directly and win the game. Now that you get the point of the game, let's change it completely. Okay, not really, but hang tight as I explain. So, as I mentioned before, we wanted to do some sort of conquest mechanic, allowing players to take monster cards and use them as their own, and vice versa. Kind of like one of those games where you send spaceships to other planets and take them over, or whatever. I don't know what they're called, but there's like 1,000 mobile games like them, so I'll probably show some on screen right now, I guess. Either way, the first playtest went so well that we had some concerns about changing everything, but we thought it was worth testing. So I decided to try and throw something together real quick with two-sided cards. Players' cards on one side and evil cards on the other. And let's just say there were some really weird unintended side effects with this. First off, it's pretty obvious now, but not something I thought of until I loaded the cards into Tabletop Simulator. And that is, you'll know exactly what card you're going to be drawing next. Each card has two sides, so as long as you have the knowledge of what's on both sides of the cards, you'll know what's coming. I tried not to knock this until I tried it. Tetris tells you what's coming next, and that's fine, right? This is the same thing. Second, it meant you couldn't have different balancing for monsters and players. Our goal with players was to have everything generally balanced around each other. No card was more powerful than the other, just different. Now, the monsters, on the other hand, were a variety of cards, some weak and some strong. So we ended up switching the monsters to be more balanced around each other for this version. Despite these potential problems, we decided to play it. And honestly, very quickly, we could tell it didn't feel great. Well, I think maybe we could get this to work. We didn't really think the novelty of reversible cards was really worth it, especially because the game felt more fun before. And on top of that, getting the game to work would take much more time and balancing. The game just snowballed way too fast, having one player or the old god getting extremely far ahead. On top of that, seeing the card you were getting next was as bad as it sounded. It would prolong the disappointment you get from not getting the card you wanted. What I mean by that is whenever you draw a card, you're obviously hoping for a good one or one you need. Unfortunately, knowing what you were getting next, if it was a card you didn't want, it ended up feeling like you had to wait longer for the card you were looking for. And even if it was the card you wanted, it felt pretty bad that you couldn't play it. So in the end, we ended up abandoning this concept completely and reverted everything back to the way it was. I just did a hand gesture like going back, but it's not like you could tell. Anyway, so now that we're back at the old version and we're having fun again, we played a few more sessions. At this point, we found ourselves mostly balancing the game, changing the different strengths of cards, going back and forth until it felt better. We're also working on clarity of the game's rules a bit. One of the biggest changes, however, was adding power level to player cards. We have been using the term damage on a few cards. This was a confusing term as having units on cards was currently the only way to add more quote-unquote damage. The thing is, units are also health. This is a problem because it was not clear when damage would be applied, but let me explain quick. Take the Barbarian, for example. They would deal 2 extra damage when attacking. Let's say they were fighting a Nethermuck here with a challenge rating of 4. At the time, a card itself was technically worth 1 unit. So let's add 2 damage to that, which gives you to a total of 3. You could add a unit to that to give you 4, but if the Barbarian decided to attack, they would die in the process. You could add an additional unit to the Barbarian, which would allow them to live through this encounter, but this effectively meant they would only have +1 damage, which most of the time is hardly a bonus at all, and you were more likely to pick a card with a better bonus. In short, dealing 2 extra damage was only really useful if you were willing to kill your hero in the process. To counteract this and make it less confusing, we gave power level to cards. This effectively gave them a static unit rating that worked as a permanent unit on the card. We realized later that this didn't actually fix the problem at all, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. At this point, the weekend was over and Kyle got pretty busy with work. So in the meantime, I decided to try to do what I could myself. Luckily, this was a co-op game, which actually meant I could play it by myself. Yeah, kind of sad, but actually ended up being pretty helpful. Again, a lot of this ended up being balancing and tweaking, but one of the major decisions I made from this playtesting was that maybe the best thing for the game was adding weaker monsters and reducing the number of stronger ones. This was because even though that units seemed to be the only resource players had, there was actually another one: action economy. On a given turn, a player could only play one of each type of cards, with the exception of spells, along with heroes only being able to attack once per turn. Having enemies with more powerful attacks made combat more about trading card for card, and not about losing units, which kind of felt against the point of the game. Adding smaller enemies meant players would generally be losing units off of cards, but still using an entire action to deal with smaller enemies. Next day, I implemented these changes and found that it was feeling better already. Both sides were allowed to ramp up, making the game feel the appropriate level of challenging, along with allowing a player to actually build up cool synergies. Being basically halfway through the jam, we decided it was about time to come up with a theme for the game. For the players, we were only really using random fictional hero names, and for the evil deck, really just generic monsters. So there were 3 options that I suggested. 1, leave it as is, meaning random monsters. This was my least favorite of the options, but probably the easiest. Most of the creatures we were using were iconic: goblins, slimes, dragons, which makes them easier to draw because they already have an iconography. Option 2 was demons. Make the cards imps, demon lords, fiends, etc. This felt more cohesive and clear-cut. And option 3 was chaos and entropy creatures. At this point, I wasn't really exactly sure what this would look like. I was kind of thinking of eldritch creatures, although honestly, I don't really know anything about eldritch lore. So I ended up kind of imagining League of Legends or Risk of Rain 2's void creatures. We thought this would probably be the most unique, but also the most challenging, as there really wasn't anything to base it on. And because I wanted to make my life harder, apparently, we ended up going with option 3 because we felt really it was the most interesting option. At this point, I started on the card art, mostly the text boxed indicators and headers. Then Kyle reached out to me with an idea to make cards more unique by giving them specific names, like how Magic cards have unique names for each card. While this was a cool idea, I had concerns for 2 reasons. One was we had multiple copies of each card in a deck. This felt weird because I didn't think it would make sense if you had 2 of the same character in each deck. Which, of course, the solution to this was to make unique versions of each card with minor differences. But at this point, something had occurred to me. I had under a week to make 80 different card arts, and I wasn't about to double that number. So Kyle came up with a good compromise by adding lore elements to the cards, like what regions the structures or heroes were from. This was a great compromise, as we could keep the game as is and only make 1 art per card. At this point, we figured the game should have a name. We went back and forth a bit, but ended up deciding on Armies against Entropy. It had some good alliteration to it and explained exactly what the game was about. So you'll notice I've been showing cards that look mostly like this throughout the video, but actually at this point, the game looked more like this, which really meant I needed to buckle down and actually get the card art done. And so the next 4 days of my life consisted of just that. By the time the 14th rolled around, I was pretty exhausted, pulling 12 to 16-hour days just trying to get the art finished. On top of that, I woke up in the morning and realized the game wasn't actually due at midnight on the 15th, it was due at midnight on the 14th. Which makes sense, but in my tired state, wasn't thinking very clearly, and still had 20 plus artworks to do for the cards, plus a card back and a board. On top of that, power level was still bothering me, and the game mod needed to be set up. Oh, and a rulebook needed to be made. So, trying to do something more important, I decided to pivot my focus. As if I didn't get the card arts done, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Which I didn't mention, but the card arts weren't really necessary. It was only 4 points out of 90, and the requirement was just that you made some card art, a requirement that we already passed. But yeah, the mod was necessary for the judges to actually play the game, so I worked on and finished that. I did some quick art for the board and got everything together pretty quickly. I was pretty happy with how it was looking and already felt better getting something done off my plate. Next was power level. You know how I said damage didn't work? Well, neither did this. It ended up being just as confusing, if not more so. Let's use our Barbarian example again. The Nethermuck has 4 power level and the Barbarian has 3. For this example, let's say the Barbarian also has 2 units on him. So in this case, you'd subtract the Barbarian's power level from the Nethermuck's power level, giving you a remainder of 1. Then the hero's units would be taken into account, so there would only be a net loss of 1 unit. So in this scenario, if you reverse attackers and defenders, it still works the same, but if you start looking at something like the Endling, it all starts to fall apart. The Endling only has a power level of 1, so taking into account the Barbarian's power level, the Endling can't do anything at all. Which, if it were only this card that was the problem, it would be one thing, but in actuality, every hero had a power level of 1, which meant the Endling couldn't ever do any damage to a hero. We playtested this so the hero's power level wasn't taken into account when they were defending, but this just made things even more confusing and more complicated. Not to mention this was just annoying tracking both power level and units, because rather than just subtracting one number from your units, you would end up having to subtract the power level first, and it all just slowed the game down. It also didn't make sense that we had structures and lands not have power level at all, which really didn't work. We never really figured it out. We just kind of ignored it, I guess. Now, we definitely could have rebalanced this to make it work, but it was already more confusing than it needed to be, and we were only really utilizing it on 2 different heroes. So as a solution, we removed power level completely and made it so whenever you placed a card, it would just start with 1 unit on it. This streamlined everything and made it feel so much better. Then the power level icon was changed to indicate whether you could attack. Then anything that had damage on it, we changed to gain units when attacking, which made more sense because we utilized the resources we already had. And lastly, all abilities that had power level were removed. And with that solved, I was back to making card art. At this point, making decisions was pretty difficult. I was more or less just drawing the first thing that came to mind, and even this was kind of difficult at this point. Thankfully, Kyle threw some random ideas at me, which helped me push to the end. Speaking of Kyle, he had finally gotten off of work that day and ended up coming in clutch and creating a rule book in about 2 hours. And with about an hour to spare, we submitted the game, and I promptly died. So, as you can tell from the intro, this didn't go very well. But what happened exactly? To get into that, let's start from the beginning. As I've been trying to get into... No, I'm kidding. We're not starting over again. This game was feeling pretty good on our end, so why were we told that there was nothing enjoyable about it? So to do that, let's go over the game. I'm going to recap the important parts, but if you want to watch the whole thing, you can watch it here. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to call the judges Judge 1 and Judge 2 because their usernames made it kind of confusing. So to start, Judge 1 was dealt a pretty bad hand, but declined his mulligan to swap out his deck. On the flip side, Judge 2 had a pretty solid hand along with a pretty good opening play. Unfortunately, because Judge 1 didn't have any heroes, any monster cards that were drawn would end up killing Judge 2's singular hero on the board. The issues continued to compound as Judge 1 continued to not pull a hero for about 3 turns and no ability to attack. This ended up putting them into a death spiral and ended with them getting completely overwhelmed with no chance of winning. So after the game, Kyle asked for a critique. Judge 2 answered first, stating that the number of lands the enemy was drawing felt bad, that the game felt like it needed balancing, and that his one positive review was that he enjoyed the combat math. He also sort of implied that the RNG of the game ended up making it feel that it wasn't balanced as well. Judge 1, well, we heard his review earlier, and that was pretty much all he had to say. So despite my personal feelings on that statement as a professional critique, there are still a few things I would take away from this experience. Judge 2's critique, both judges' emotional reaction to the game, and the game as a whole. The main one, despite some minor bugs, was that the game wasn't fun when you're behind, meaning the game could maybe benefit from some comeback mechanics or cards, and that lands might just be too powerful. I ended up thinking about the game all night, and the thing that bothered me most was whether the game was actually winnable or not. If the judges had been bound to fail from the beginning, it meant the game was broken. But if not, it would mean that it was just a skill issue. Is that rude to say? I don't know, whatever. So the next morning, I decided I needed to take a look into it. I figured because I had a recording of the stream, I could actually dissect the game in the order of which the cards were played and see what could have been done differently. And it turns out that the game was actually completely winnable. In fact, we had a decisive victory over the old gods. Here's what we found out. The first thing that would have changed the course of the game is if Judge 1 took his mulligan. However, I didn't really want to rely on that to prove that the game wasn't broken, as that would be sort of more a random outcome. So we continued to play the game as it was dealt. The second mistake was Judge 1 not allocating his units properly and utilizing the cards he did have. He had played a trading post, which was arguably the right move. However, he did not allocate any units turn 1. If he did, he could have ended up saving Judge 2's hero from dying. And the third mistake was them choosing to destroy their lands when it came to the Old God's Desolation card. This card forces the players to destroy one of their own cards of their choice. The judges opted to destroy their lands. This was bad for a few reasons. For one, structures can only be placed above a land, meaning without the lands they couldn't play any new structures despite Judge 1 only having structures in his hand. This meant he couldn't play any cards at all, removing pretty much all his options for doing anything. This was also bad because lands provide units, which allows you to have higher attack power. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't allow this card to destroy land from underneath a structure, but that was an edge case that we weren't totally prepared for. With these changes, along with a few minor ones, we ended up winning the game. If you're curious about the whole thing, I ended up having a live stream of that as well. So what we got from this is maybe the important thing to learn from this experience is to set expectations, meaning this game is going to be hard your first time around, and that there's a likelihood of failure if you haven't played it before. I like comparing it to a roguelike a bit. You may fail when playing it, but you'll get back up and do it again. Although, unfortunately, this wasn't how the judging worked, and we only had an hour for them to play the game, and they only got to play it once. But what can you do? We ended up placing 16th out of 20, which was about as well as we would have expected based on our judging. We ended up getting a little more feedback from the judges, which was nice, but not much more than we had learned from watching them play the game as a whole. All in all, it felt pretty bad doing that poorly after working on something for so long, but there was no real prize for the competition, and I was really proud of how the game turned out as a whole. So all in all, I can't really be too upset. I should also probably say, even though that this video sounds like me coping that my game did badly and me trying to make it out like it doesn't have any problems, it definitely does. And in fairness to the judges, after playtesting the game about 12 more times since the jam, despite 90% of those games being victories, land still does seem to be a problem, as it's never a choice whether you should attack them or not. But also, in fairness to me, this game is something that was made in 2 weeks, so obviously it's going to have its fair share of problems. Which leads me pretty well into our last bit here. So now that the jam is over, now what? Well, I really did end up enjoying this game and kind of want to continue working on it along with my main project, Soul. But in what capacity? Well, the first thing is more playtesting, and for that, I would love to have your help. I want to get more opinions on the game, what people think, and see if it's something worth pursuing further. If it is, I would like to expand the concept, allow for actual deck building, potentially having even more options for game modes as well, like more players or different opponents. I'm even considering making a video game version. It's something I want to do eventually for my main project, but this game is much more simplistic, so I think it might be something better to learn on, as I have literally no code experience. But yeah, if you are interested in this game, feel free to download the mod for Tabletop Simulator down below and give it a try. And please, let me know what you think. I would love to hear your opinion. Or better yet, join my Discord server where I'll be hosting regular playtesting sessions and we can play the game together. Or if you're more old school, I will have print and play versions both in the description and on my Discord server as well. As a side note, I will have an update coming out for the game along with this video to hopefully fix some of the problems that we talked about. Lastly, I just started a Patreon to hopefully help fund these creative endeavors, to help me keep working on these videos and working on Soul and Armies against Entropy further. There's not a whole lot in terms of rewards, but I put on there what I can, and I would really appreciate any support you'd be willing to give. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.